Welcome to video number 3 in Module 309, the Class 4 Driver Training course. This particular video focuses on Chapter 3 of the manual, which starts at about roughly page 25 or 27 and goes for 40 pages. So it's a substantial chapter, and there's a fair amount in this particular video as well. I really urge you not to just skip through it, because a large part of the material that will be on the exam, both the Class 4 Learner's License as well as our in-class test, will come from this particular video. It's also important that you reread the chapter, because I don't even try to touch on every single thing in the chapter in this video. There are some things, like for example roundabouts and backing up from large vehicles, that are not dealt with here. So I really encourage you to go back and look at that chapter, which runs at about page 25 to about page 65. So let's get started. The first basic skill we want to talk about in this particular one is following distance. The following distance was mentioned in an earlier video, but I want to go back and examine it more closely, because it has a lot to do with the vehicles that you're driving, the vehicles that you're behind, and the conditions in which you're driving. Here's why. In the upper diagram, you've got two passenger vehicles, regular cars or vans, and the yellow car can go behind the blue car with a 2-second count. And the reason is they're both going to take roughly the same amount of stopping distance. And if you don't remember how to do the count or to achieve the 2 seconds in difference, the way you do this, and you can see it depicted in the diagram here, is to find a roadside object. As the first car goes past it, you count out loud your 1 1,000, 2 1,000, and your front bumper should not pass until you've got to 2 1,000s. But as you can see, the distance goes up considerably when a larger vehicle is behind a smaller vehicle. And this, by the way, goes even shorter, or sorry, needs to get even bigger if this vehicle is a motorcycle, because motorcycles are the easiest to stop. They have the least amount of mass for the amount of braking power that they bring. So you can see that with a large vehicle, this distance can go up to about 5 seconds. ICBC asks for 2 seconds of following time for vehicles that are of van size. But if your vehicle is extended by having additional capacity built into it, your time could be as much as 3 seconds, especially given the fact that, as we talked about in an earlier video, you don't want to hammer the brakes and potentially have wheelchairs come loose or have people come off their seats and get injured. And remember, of course, that these are perfect conditions in the diagrams. If there are poor conditions, whether it's getting dark or the lights in your eyes, whether it's foggy or rainy or snowing or icy, or whether the vehicle itself is not performing perfectly. For example, if your windshield wipers aren't working perfectly and you can't see as well as normal, then you want to increase the amount of distance between yourself and the other vehicle. So just remember that larger vehicles need more time to stop, and especially it's important when we're behind lighter and smaller vehicles. When you're driving down the highway, sometimes people are going a little bit above the speed limit. And the general rule is, as long as people are within a few kilometers above the speed limit, it is better to drive with the flow. Don't try to be beating people, and don't try to be really slow, because people will start cutting into you and potentially causing you to be in danger. If somebody does cut in or cut you off, don't get into an argument with them or lose your cool. Instead, slow down to increase your following distance, so it's back to 2 seconds to 5 seconds based on the size of vehicle you're driving. The other thing we want to talk about is tailgaters. Again, people often get frustrated when somebody is tailgating behind them. They start hitting the brakes, or they start going slower on purpose. The best thing to do is to go slow down to a point where the other individual can safely pass you. Don't tell them to pass you, but if you really feel unsafe, you can find a safe place to pull over and let people go by you. That's not a very common convention in British Columbia, but in places like Alberta, where there's a large farming community and there's often machines that are on the road that are very slow, it's very common for people to just pull over and let others go past them. So I strongly recommend that you get in the habit of doing that. We also want you to recognize your danger zone, which basically means that area in front of you where you couldn't stop if you had to. If somebody was to have a soccer ball go out the front yard and their child went running after it, or if a dog got off of a leash, would you be able to stop? And the idea for us is to cover the brake pedal, and that simply means having our braking foot close to the brake pedal, sort of hovering over top, whenever we're going through areas where we know there's a higher risk of somebody entering our danger zone. As I mentioned earlier, when people are walking down the road or bringing their pets or children are obviously playing, or in a construction area or a place where people are parking along the side of the road and getting in and out of their cars frequently. These are all examples of places where I might cover the brake. It's also important to plan your escape routes. As a general rule, we don't want to drive in the center lanes when driving on a major highway because people can box us in on either side. Instead, pick the slow lane if you possibly can, the right lane, and be aware of what obstacles or limitations you might have to pulling over if you need to. Most of the time, the safest place to pull out of the way is onto the right shoulder if something comes into your lane unexpectedly. So be thinking ahead about where you might go. And if you're in an HOV lane, of course, HOV lanes are usually the furthest to the left in on a highway. And sometimes they're boxed in. Sometimes they literally have barriers that make it impossible to get out of them. But it also usually makes it difficult for people to cross over into your area. So that's kind of the trade-off there. But even if you're in the furthest left lane, think about where you might go. One thing about driving a larger vehicle is that you'll become more aware of something that many people don't know, and that is that when the wheels on your car turn, they do not turn in parallel. Look at this diagram, and you can see that the wheel that's here on the right is more turned than the vehicle on the left. And that's because if we didn't do that, it would take us way too long to go around a corner. And that's particularly going to be the case when we're driving at slow speeds. When you're driving at parking lot speeds, your vehicle really needs to be able to pivot around this more turned in vehicle. We call this towing in. And this happens if you were to turn the other direction on this wheel. So it's very important for us to understand that our wheels are going to behave in a bit of a different way than they might with a small vehicle. The front wheels do not follow immediately behind the back wheels. And the longer your vehicle is, or what we call a longer wheelbase, the more likely that you're going to actually pull the rear wheels over something like a curb or a sidewalk with people on it. So it's really important to make sure that you learn how to turn, giving yourself additional space so that you don't drag your back wheels into something or somebody. Wheel position is something that you may see on the test, and be prepared for this diagram. Some rules to follow. Go into the turn slowly. Vehicles turn much better at a slow rate because you can turn your wheels with your hands faster. And make sure you do not crossing your hands when you're driving, nor should you have your hand inside of the spokes of the steering wheel. Those little captain's knobs that you see people sometimes installing are illegal. And the reason is that if you hit a curb or a pothole, your steering wheel can simply jerk out of your hand and you can lose your grip, or you can even become injured in that circumstance. So instead, you want to be reaching hand over hand as you're going around the corner. Make sure that you are actually quite a ways from the curb if you're turning to the right especially, and we want to drive until we see that the curb is parallel to the front door of our vehicle. And I have a diagram coming up of that in a moment. Now, a curb with a B means the concrete or a pavement edge of a road. A curva with a VE means a bend in the road that we don't stop to take. And so they talk about curves as well. Curves are different than turns because we don't normally have to signal to take them. So when we're driving across a curve, there are two forces that are working against us. And in the book, there are diagrams that show these. One of these is called inertia. Inertia is a force that basically wants us to not change direction. When we try to turn, it wants us to keep going straight. So if we were to use this example here, this vehicle is trying to go this way, but its mass wants it to go straight in the direction of my arrow. Centrifugal force, or you'll hear people sometimes pronounce it centrifugal force, it's the same thing, is a force that makes things want to spin on the outside of a circle. If you ever done spinning art, for example, at the P&E, you've seen this, or spun something around on a plate, you've seen that the drips of water want to go out. And that's what's happening here too. This vehicle wants to pull off the road in this direction as well. So it's got something pulling it this way, and it's got something pulling it this way. two forces working against us. The only force that's helping us is the force of traction, the friction that these tires have against this road. And of course, it's really important for us to recognize that wet, icy, or gravel roads therefore have less traction, less to compete against those other forces. Similarly, if the tires are in bad shape or are bald, that happens. And more on that later on. So what we want to do is basically try to work with these forces. And that's what this shows. So that when we are moving into a direction on an outside curve, you can see that the person is going to apex the turn. And what's a fancy way of saying is that they hug the outside of the turn, follow my arrow, and then they start to go in like this. It's much better than if they try to hug the line, which is a mistake many people make, and then they have a hard time keeping control. Another thing that's important to understand is one does not brake in the corners. One should brake before the corner and then start to accelerate once they're about halfway through the corner. And that new acceleration will create new inertia in a new direction. So it's really a powerful difference. Try it when you're driving home tonight. See what happens if you do all your braking before you enter the corner and then speed up coming out. And see what happens if you stick to the outside of the curve when you're going on the around the outside lane. And here you can see that the person is doing the same thing, only now the center line is the outside of his turn. And again, he has to brake beforehand. This is very noticeable on a motorcycle. If you've ridden a motorcycle and you don't do this, you'll literally start to wobble or you won't be able to get around the turn. So it's a very important thing. Now, two things I don't have illustrated here, but I'll talk about briefly, are traffic circles and backing up. And there are illustrations and expansions on this in the book, and I'd strongly recommend that you read it. So there are two different kinds of traffic circles. There's a larger one and a smaller one. And what's really important to understand is in the smaller ones, there's just one lane. But in the larger ones, there are two lanes. And there's also usually an apron made out of pavement or brick. And it looks almost like a garden. Now, if you're driving a small car, you'll have no concern about this at all. You'll just keep around the outside of the curve. But again, if you're driving a vehicle with a larger wheelbase, it's actually legally allowed for the back wheels of your vehicle to go onto this apron. In fact, it may be impossible to avoid it. But you also have to realize that you can sometimes cut off vehicles that are on the inside lane of the traffic circle. So you have to be much more careful if you're entering into a traffic circle with a larger than usual vehicle. So make sure you understand those rules very carefully. I can tell you that because traffic circles perplex many people, it's absolutely an area of focus both in the ICBC written exam as well as in the road test. And backing up, you'll also see some material there. And basically, to summarize it, what it says is you're far better off to back into a parking space than to back out of a parking space, especially in a larger vehicle. If you have to back out into traffic, the graphics show you the best way to do that with or without a helper. If you have a helper, it's important that the helper stands near the back of your vehicle on the driver's side so that they can see the oncoming traffic, they can see the tail of your vehicle, and you can see them in your side view mirror. And if you're by yourself, it's really important that you make sure that you get out and go and take a look at your surroundings and pick a particularly cautious time in which to pull out. Now, a little thing that many people don't know is that it is not only legal, but sometimes a very good idea for a person to park in a parking spot by pulling through an empty parking spot and therefore having their vehicle facing out. If you can imagine two parking spots across from each other that are empty, it is completely legal to pull into a parking spot and park on the other empty parking spots that you're facing outward. But you have to be careful if you're doing this in a wheelchair-equipped van, because if your vehicle needs to release people through the back, then you could be completely unable to do that if somebody parks in your spot. Of course, you'll be able to park in disabled spots if you're driving a wheelchair-equipped van. So be aware of all these things, and again, review the book. What about being seen on the road and seeing? When we're driving a regular vehicle, we have blind spots we're familiar with on the left and the right side. And if you're not familiar with them and the need to do shoulder checks, then you should go back and review those concepts. Our mirrors do not capture every bit of space between us and other vehicles. Sometimes we have to turn our head and quickly glance to see if they're there. But when we're driving a large vehicle, there are two additional blind spots that we may not be able to get around. The first is in front of us. So if you're driving a van or a commercial vehicle with sort of a blunted front or what's called a cab over design, you often cannot see what's directly in front of you, and that can take some getting used to. And then behind you is a large blind spot as well. In many wheelchair-equipped vans, the wheelchair lift blocks the rear window, or mesh material obscures part of your view. So you have to get very good at using your rear view mirrors, your side view mirrors, because your rear view mirror does very, very little for you in that context. And it's also important to be able to use what we call the convex mirrors, the little bubble-shaped mirrors that are on the back, on the part of your window that shows a little bit more of your mirror. I'm having difficulty with this one, that shows a little bit of the blind spot this way. But shoulder checking becomes very, very important, and I become far less likely to switch lanes and far more cautious about things like merging and making sure I signal well in advance. So I try to stay in the right lane, which is called the slow lane. Some people call it the granny lane, that's its nickname. But you're far better to stay in the right lane and maintain a safe speed. The pullover lane, the pulling past lane, I should say, is the left lane, and it's only meant for you to go into just briefly if you have to get around somebody. Also important for you to make sure that you understand the rules about pulling over. And the rule is that you must pull over in any undivided highway. So this highway is not divided. It simply has yellow lines in the middle of it. If it had a concrete or painted median, or it had a big grassy median like a freeway, then I would only have to pull over if the vehicles are on the same side as me. Doesn't matter what lane, as long as they were on the same side of the road. So if I could see a vehicle coming in my rear view mirror or my side view mirror, I would pull over where it was safest to do that, making sure to use my signals. And it's also usually a good idea to put your hazard lights on so that other people can tell that you're pulling over, and therefore they'll get the signal to do the same thing. If you are in a divided highway, again, you do not need to pull over if the vehicle is going this direction. But in this example, in the top diagram, it's not a divided highway. A yellow line does not constitute a division, and you have to pull over no matter whether the vehicle is in your direction or the safety vehicle is going in the other direction. If an emergency vehicle is coming, you must pull over. And we're going to talk more about what constitutes an emergency vehicle later in this video. Important to understand as well that sometimes we'll be driving vehicles that are a bit old school. Now, it's not very likely that you'll be driving a vehicle like this, but if you are driving an older vehicle, you need to understand that some old-fashioned vehicles had something called double clutching. If you drive a standard vehicle now, you're used to the idea that you have to push the clutch down to pull the gear shift out of one gear and then put it into the next gear. And usually we do this with no feet on any pedals except the clutch, nothing on the brake and nothing on the gas. But if we were double clutching, what we would have to do is push the clutch down to release the gear from its current position, then push it down a second time to put it into the next gear. And believe it or not, that's what happens in a lot of larger trucks. So there are times when the person who's shifting gears does not have their vehicle in gear. And that's simply a way of making the clutch inside the car slow down or work at the same speed as you want to shift into. It's not really important to understand all the technical, but it is important to understand what double clutching is, because double clutching could be on the exam. The notion of torque and lugging is also possible to be on the exam. Torque is the spinning force of your engine, and that's what actually twists your wheels. Twisting your wheels, if you've ever ridden a bike, you know is harder when you're going uphill. So what do? Well, we normally move the size of the gears on our bikes down from the big wide ones to the small ones. And the reason that we're doing that is we're giving ourselves more twisting power. Our wheels aren't going to travel as quickly, but each time we rotate our feet around one spin of the sprocket, we're going to give that rear wheel 2 or 3 spins. And so we're using our strength wisely. It works exactly the same way on an engine. In other words, to put this in simple terms, if you're going up a hill and you can feel your vehicle is lugging or slowing down, working too hard to get up, feels like it might stall, shift into a lower gear and then resume driving. And if you're doing that consistently, it means that you're not shifting down when you should. On an automatic vehicle, you probably don't need to do this except if you're going up a really steep hill or if your vehicle has a setting called overdrive. Some vehicles have a button that you can push called overdrive, and many of my students think that this makes their vehicle go really fast. But overdrive is actually more about saving gas than it is about anything. It's meant for when we're driving at a highway speed on a relatively flat road. We don't need a lot of responsiveness in the gas pedal to the wheels when we do that. So if we were to stay in this very large gear, which is why it's called overdrive, we wouldn't get very much power going up hills. And not only would it actually make us go slower, but now at this point it stops making us any savings on gas. We actually have to push the gas pedal down more. Again, if that's in the case with you're driving an automatic vehicle with an overdrive button, click it off when you're going up and down hills. When you're passing people in a vehicle that has a cube on it, such as a cube van or an extension on it, or something like a semi-trailer, you have a far higher amount of turbulence that comes off your vehicle than you might experience driving a more aerodynamic passenger car. Aerodynamics are far more advanced on the cars we drive every day than they are on these big passenger vehicles, and they're built more for the ease of loading and unloading. And again, if you've ever ridden a bicycle or motorcycle around one of these large vehicles, you'll know that they throw a lot of turbulence, and that's why we want to be careful. We don't want to push people over or suck them under our wheels using our turbulence. So be very, very careful if you're going past vehicles that are smaller, like scooters, motorcycles, or bicycles, so that you don't push people over. Slow down and give space. Avoid passing people if you don't have enough power, because what happens is people all get back behind you, and then they start trying to pass you, often up and down hills where they don't have good sight lines. If you want to let people know that you're going to be slowing down, put your hazard lights or four-way flashers on. Do not roll your window down and wave at people to pass you, because you do not know what their vehicle's capabilities are, and you don't know if they're actually going to be safe. So don't tell people to do that. Instead, stay as far as you can to the shoulder of the road while still making sure you're safe, so that they have a good sight line. If you have a lot of people behind you, you might want again to employ the Alberta rule. Pull over and let people pass you. I'm telling you, you'll be the most popular person on the road that day. Many people also get messed up when it comes to the subject of parking. One of the most basic things to do is that we want to make sure we always set our parking brake, also known as our emergency brake. In the old days, people used them literally to stop because it was so common for brakes to fail. Now we typically think of them as a way to set the brakes permanently when we park our car. And in fact, we often don't do it in our personal cars unless we're on a hill, but we should. We should do it all the time. The one exception to this rule is if you live in a place where it's really, really cold and where there's been a lot of moisture, because sometimes the brake can actually freeze shut, but that's a rare condition. So the rule that people often get messed up with is, how do I park my vehicle on a hill? And I want you to look at this diagram, which, by the way, is not from the ICBC book, but there is a comparable diagram that comes up on their test, and it's important for you to recognize it. So if you are parking and you're going down a hill, and unfortunately this particular diagram doesn't show that there's meant to be a curb here, but it really doesn't matter. If there's a curb or no curb, notice that these wheels are always pointed to the edge of the road. If this vehicle was to break loose, it would roll off the road and head onto the shoulder, and presumably it would be less likely to hurt somebody down the hill. So it's always about turning your wheels toward the side of the road when you are going downhill. If you're going uphill, it changes dependent on whether or not there's a curb. When you're going uphill, turn the wheels this way toward the center of the road, and this will allow the back of your tires to rub against the curb. And I even sometimes roll back a little bit until I feel that the tire is seated there. Again, put it into emergency brake and lock your wheel. You can tell when you pull your key out that if you click your steering wheel a little bit, it'll lock there so that this wheel position doesn't change. If you're going uphill and there's no curb, this changes because now this vehicle would roll out this way and go off the road, oops, if it was to break loose, okay? Make sure you always turn the engine off and do not leave passengers alone in any parked vehicle, even if it is on a flat surface. Now, let's say you're running an errand and there's 2 staff people and both staff people have the right to drive that vehicle. Then you can have the passenger get out and go and do the shopping and the driver stays. The driver can then move the vehicle if there's some issue and can get people to emergency care if there's some issue. But don't leave the passenger seat empty don't leave the driver's seat empty when you leave people in the vehicle. Okay? Never. All right, and I think that, and blocking wheels. So you can buy something called wheel chocks, C-H-O-C-K, and they are small triangular plastic or wooden shapes. They often have straps or handles on them, and they're very easy to store in the vehicle. And again, if you're on a road where you're worried about the vehicle staying in position, you can put chocks behind the wheels on whatever the downhill side is so that the wheels are that much less likely to roll. We'll use them in our pre-trip inspection. There are some skills that were affiliated with crossings in the chapter as well. Of course, one of the most common places for crossings is the crosswalk. And I don't have a diagram here, but it's very important for you to understand how crosswalks work. Crosswalks are a place where pedestrians have the right of way. That means they have the right to go first. And what many people don't understand is the rules state that you must stop at a crosswalk if a person is in or near the crosswalk. In other words, it looks like they want to enter it in your lane or the lanes in your direction. In other words, imagine that you're on a road that has 2 or 3 lanes going in the same direction. Somebody enters the crosswalk and walks in front of your car. You might be tempted to start leaving, but as long as that person is still on your side of the road, you cannot do that. Once they've crossed the center line, you can do that. If they're walking towards you, you cannot do it until they have cleared the whole road. In other words, you can't try to get across the crosswalk when somebody's in it before they get to your side of the road. And some crosswalks are signaled. They have a pedestrian-operated button. And when that button goes off, the light turns red. When the light turns red, you have to stay until it turns green again, no matter whether there is still a pedestrian in the crosswalk or not. If a person is waiting near a crosswalk, that counts as being in the crosswalk. So unless the person identifies to you after you've stopped that they are not crossing, you must wait until they cross, even if they're slow. All right, and the reason for all of this, by the way, is that other vehicles may not be able to see a person in the crosswalk, and they will notice that you are braked, and they will brake too. At least that's the idea behind it. At alleys, such as the one in the top picture, where there's no road markings, the person is expected to stop before the walkway. So the vehicle in this case has not actually stopped correctly. They are in the roadway. They should think of it as though there was a marking there and create an imaginary crosswalk. Railway crossings are also going to come up. The rule is that you should stop 5 to 15 meters away if you are carrying any passengers at all. And you'll notice that that means that the vehicle is not just stopped at the front gate in this picture. Even if there is no marking on a crosswalk, you're expected to stop 5 to 15 meters. 5 meters is 15 feet, folks. That's a lot. So 15 meters is 45 feet away so that you can clearly see whether there are trains coming. Remember that in our area there is a lot of activity that is on the tracks that does not involve trains. There are things called high rails, which are pickup trucks equipped to drive on the rails, and there are small trolley cars that go out to inspect the rails. And believe me, when you have one almost hit you, and I've had this happen, you really learn the importance of clearly checking across railway crossings. And I know there are many places where trains are rare in our area, but you don't ever want to make the assumption that there's not going to be a train there. You'll notice it talks about allowing 10 seconds. What it means is thinking about the size of your vehicle and the power of your vehicle. Make sure that you're going to have a full 10 seconds to get across that road before anything that's coming towards you might come at an uncontrolled track. And of course, it should go without saying that we never drive around or try to get under the crossing arm before it goes down. You also want to watch for something called humpback tracks. Again, when you're driving a small vehicle, you probably don't have to think about this. But when you're driving a larger vehicle where the tracks are elevated above the road, and you'll see some examples of this in Matsqui, it's possible for you to actually ground your vehicle out, to drag part of your vehicle on the ground if you go too quickly over these areas. You might even see places when you go across them where people's cars have hit the pavement and caused these large gouges. So you don't want that to happen because it's very bad for the vehicle and for the passengers. So you want to make sure you have 10 seconds and that you're slow. If you're in a standard vehicle, don't shift while crossing the track because there's no easier time to stall out than when you're shifting. Now, acts of nature. Understand that animals like deer are far more likely to move at dusk and dawn. They're what they call crepuscular animals, which is your new word of the day. They are not diurnal or nocturnal. They mostly move at dusk and dawn. And so you'll often see something like the picture in the diagram where deer are just starting to poke their head out just about an hour or a half an hour before the sun would go down. That for them is the safest time. And remember that sun goes down about a half an hour before it's actually dark. Dusk is usually about a half an hour long where we live. And oftentimes all you can see are the reflections of a deer's eyes on the side of the road. So that's one thing you want to watch for. What deer will often do is they'll jump out into the road because of course to them they can't tell the difference between a road and a road's edge. They see your lights and now they're stuck. They're frozen there. They literally have a natural defense mechanism to freeze in place. So it's very important for us to slow down anywhere where there is a high risk of this. And we're fortunate because most of us live in a place where animal crossings are clearly marked. And it's funny because many of us just have learned to ignore them. But there are literally set areas where animals frequently cross. Keep your eyes on the edge of the road, especially in ditches or depressions like that one in the picture, because animals are often kind of tucked in there. And especially when they have young animals with them, the young animals will kind of just jump out. Keep your lights, windshield wipers, defroster, and windshield clean and in good condition. Make sure that when you go into a gas station, you're wiping off all of these things, that you're actually getting out the window cleaner and using it on your headlights as well so that you have good vision. Make sure you have the proper lights on. Don't turn your high beams on in the snow or the fog because it actually just reflects back in your eyes. High beams are used on clear nights usually and sometimes in rain. And it's important to make sure that you switch them down to low beam again if you notice that somebody is coming. So if somebody's 150 meters or less away from you, either in front of you on your lane or coming towards you, switch to low beam again so that they don't get blinded. And don't flash your lights at other people because you just blind them. There's a line on the right side of the road most of the time. It's usually white. It's called the fog line, and its job is to help you know where the road is if it's really foggy or difficult to see. So slow down and use that line as your guide so that you're not accidentally crossing over the center line. We also want to talk about vehicle safety. We've talked about vehicle conditions and changing your driving based on that. But of course, the condition of your vehicle changes a lot over time as well. When we buy our tires, usually that's when they're at their most grippy. And over the course of time, they start to wear down. There's a point at which they'll need to be replaced, but even when they're still considered to be good, they'll often have less traction, particularly in snow or rain or cold, than they would when they were new. Some things that you can do to make sure that this is less likely to cause you to have an accident are really learn how to check your tire pressure. We're going to demonstrate this during our practical pre-trip inspection. But some things that you can keep in mind are you should check your tires when they're cool because, of course, the air in them will expand under hot conditions and give you a deceivingly high pressure rating. Don't give them too much air like the one in the far right of this diagram because it will cause the middle of the tire to wear prematurely. The opposite happens if we do underinflation, because these tires have wire or metal in the outsides of them that keeps them rigid. That's what we mean by a radial tire. And what happens is that the outsides will wear out quickly. Instead, you want to be in the prescribed range, and I'll show you that you can see it right on the wall of the tire when you go to fill it. Don't overheat your tires, meaning if you're driving in really hot conditions and you're stopping a lot and braking a lot hard, or you're really heating up your brakes, it's a good idea to pull over, get in the shade, let your tires cool down a bit. If you notice during your pre-trip inspection that there's anything defective on your tire, that's definitely a don't drive situation. So that means things like tires that are bald. And what we mean by bald is the wear bars are showing. I'll show you what a wear bar looks like when we get to our pre-trip. But basically, if you look in the groove of a tire, you'll see a little raised bar about 2 millimeters in thickness. If it is at the level where the road would touch it, your tires need to be replaced. They probably should have been replaced a bit before that. If any of the cords or metal in your tire is showing, or if you have a crack that's 2.5 centimeters or longer, about an inch, then you want to get those tires replaced. A little bit of cracking is not that unusual in tires, particularly in cold climates, but if they're cracked all the way through, or if the crack is long, we want to get them fixed right away. If you have a flat tire, make sure you pull over right away. Not only will it be far more likely that you can fix the tire and save a lot of money, but a tire that is on your rim flopping around as you continue to drive is a very high risk to catch fire, and the rim itself will start to go against the road, throwing sparks, and that has been a major cause of forest fires as well. So it's good for everybody if you pull over sooner. Inspect the wheels as well. The wheels are the metal part, or sometimes the plastic cover and the metal part of the overall system. If there's any cracks there, or if the actual bolts called lugs that hold them are broken anyway, bent or loose, then you know you need to stop and get that fixed right away. And believe it or not, I've actually seen in a Class 4 vehicle a wheel come right off. I was driving on Highway 1 in New Westminster, going past roughly where the IKEA was, and a vehicle was driving down the road, and a wheel completely came off of a white extended van, and the vehicle stopped. Luckily, it was able to stop, but the wheel continued down the highway for probably another kilometer it was going 100 kilometers an hour, and it bounced everywhere. It was very lucky that it didn't hurt somebody. I read a story about somebody who did have a vehicle wheel fall off, and it went through the vehicle and killed a passenger's to the windshield. So it's very important for us to be careful. If you have any indications of brake failure, for example on your dash, stop immediately and get them repaired immediately. You also have to remember that in these vehicles you'll be expected to have safety devices, and you'll have to be able to recognize the safety devices of other vehicles. So we talked about this earlier. Emergency vehicles always have red in their siren or light bar. Police, fire, and ambulance have red lights. So if a vehicle has red lights, it means it's an emergency vehicle, and the rules about pulling over apply to you. Now, they will also have another color. Police will have blue, and so will ambulances, but it's the red that denotes that it's an emergency vehicle. Vehicles that have yellow, such as construction vehicles or plows, are not requiring you to pull over. They're advising you to proceed with caution. There's often flag people working alongside of those vehicles. Watch and respond to flag people, and realize that construction zones mean slower speeds and higher fines if you don't follow them. If you have to pull over, you'll need to make sure that you use your warning devices. Warning devices are required if you have 10 or more passengers in a vehicle, and that's kind of this thing I mentioned earlier, that often there are confusing numbers in the tests. So make a note of 10, 11, and 12. So warning devices like roadside flares or flashing signals, or those little glowing triangles that sometimes you may have seen, any one of them will work, but they're all important in a vehicle that has 10 or more passengers, and that includes you. And you can see that you're required to put them out in front of your vehicle and behind your vehicle a distance of 30 meters if you have to pull over. Even if you're completely off the road, you need to do this. Even if your hazard lights are on. By the way, even if your vehicle carries less than that number, but your vehicle is particularly wide, 2.3 meters, then you still need them as well. They also want you to focus on your personal safety, and they want you to be really careful about being in vehicles and understanding carbon monoxide risk. Carbon monoxide can enter a vehicle from the fuel or through the combustion of fuel. Because what happens in a car that's not properly tuned up is that it will burn the fuel and create this byproduct called carbon monoxide. The problem with carbon monoxide is that you cannot smell it or detect it. So it's important to make sure that you're only driving a vehicle that's in good condition. I once had a vehicle that had some rust in the floor pan, and the vehicle would have exhaust fumes come into the cab of the vehicle, and it would make me sleepy. Definitely not a safe situation, and it needed to be remedied. You also don't want to pump gas in an enclosed space or have people in the vehicle when you're using gas around them. Some of the symptoms to look for if a person has carbon monoxide poisoning: one of the most common thing is that people will start to feel dizzy or drowsy. They may complain of headaches or nausea, and it's a particular type of aching headache. People can die from this type of poisoning and die fairly rapidly. Their skin often turns really kind of pink because it's not got enough oxygen. You also want to make sure that the seat belts and airbags in the vehicles are operational and that you have the proper settings on them. If you're working with people who are under a particular weight, then the airbags may need to be turned off. And don't forget about the fact that there are rules around the use of child safety seats, and a lot of people ignore them. So they think that their child can come out of them when they reach a certain age. Well, age and weight are both a factor. It's really important to understand that they are required and that you need to make sure that you're securing those properly. Handheld cell phones and digital devices are absolutely not allowed in these vehicles, and I wouldn't even use them with single touch if I was driving a passenger. Usually I would let my coworkers help me find some information if I needed it, or my clients, or if I had to, I would use voice check. But the best procedure is to do all of that work while you're pulled over and completely stationary. And it should go without saying that drugs and alcohol have absolutely no place when driving, especially in a commercial vehicle. And roadside suspensions and vehicle impoundment will have an extra consequence for you. You will lose your job and likely have a criminal record that will keep you from getting a new one. But not only should we be aware of impairment from drugs and alcohol, but from medications as well, not just illicit drugs, and from other things such as fatigue, emotions, and even distractions like dealing with passenger needs or eating or playing games with people along the road. So make sure that you're first and foremost focused on keeping yourself fit and able to do and be a safe driver. Don't be like Sean Penn. When you're filling up the vehicle, one of the most important things to make sure is that nobody else is in it, period, and that you are not smoking or allowing smoking near the vehicle afterwards. Make sure that the tires and brakes are not really hot on the vehicle, and you want to ground the nozzle on the filler pipe. What that simply means is tap the metal filler pipe on the nozzle of your gas tank before you start pumping gas. That way any static electricity that you've built up won't automatically create a spark. Make sure that the vehicle is shut off and that there are no fuel leaks. And make sure that you have an extinguisher in your vehicle. If you are driving a vehicle that has 11 or more passengers, you'll be required to have it, and you'll need to understand how to use it to stop a fire. All right, that concludes chapter number 3, video number 3. But as I've mentioned a number of times, make sure you study this section comprehensively and answer the questions at the end of it to make sure that you are prepared.